that succeed us may not have the same interest in nuclear weapons as we have had, because we grew up with them, in effect. And I'm just hoping the younger generation will continue to show the interest that all of you have. I have a niece over here who's a different generation, and she's interested because she's here, and a son, a nephew who's here too, so it's a good sign. Let me tell you a bit about what I've been doing, just to show you why I'm here. I started out at the Atomic Energy Commission, when there was such a thing, in 1954. And through a fluke, I got involved in some nuclear test ban negotiations. The fluke happened to be that we had a test program for March of 1954 in the Pacific of a thermonuclear device, and it was programmed to be at about 6 to 8 megatons. And it turned out there was a scientific miscalculation, and it turned out to be 15 megatons. And it spread radioactive debris over a large part of the Pacific, dusted some Japanese fishermen, one of whom died later on, and caused quite a bit of uproar. And from that episode, there became a renewed interest. There had been an interest earlier, but in 1954, there was a renewed interest in doing something about limiting these kinds of nuclear tests. And so I got involved in that at the Atomic Energy Commission. And finally, in 1963, 50 years ago this month, there was a limited test ban treaty that came into effect. One of the last acts of John Kennedy was to sign the ratification and put that into effect after the Senate had approved it. Of course, as you know, he was killed a month later. Anyway, the point of that is that I've been involved in these things for a very long time, off and on, not consistently. I've been a negotiator of the test ban to begin with. Also a series of things that I probably won't talk very much about today, but I was talking earlier about the Nunn-Lugar program, which I'll be glad to speak about, because what it did, with the support of Senators Nunn and Lugar, was to help the Russians and other countries who had nuclear weapons after the collapse of the Soviet Union to help get rid of them, put them in secure places, and so forth. So from that day to this, I've had an abiding interest in it, and I'm going to tell you today why I have. I'm going to talk a lot about presidents in this few minutes we have here, because in our system, presidents have a very special role. They are the ones that can release nuclear weapons for use. They are the ones that approve the strategy that governs their use. They are, in effect, the national command authority, is what they call it in the military. It's a very undemocratic kind of system, frankly, but that's the way it had to be during the Cold War, because we needed to be able to respond immediately to attacks from the Soviet Union. And so presidents have had and still have a really unique role in our system, unlike anything else that I can think of. And that's still the system. And our nuclear weapons are still on fail power, and presidents still have that authority. Now, having said that, every president that I've known, and I've worked with several of them, some up close, some from a more remote position, have always said we ought to do something about this. And I listened to them, and I've wondered what it is that they wanted to do. Not till my, I won't say good friend, but I worked fairly closely with Ronald Reagan. And I want to tell you a bit about that later, because he had a very interesting, and in fact remarkable view of nuclear weapons. Put yourself in Harry Truman's place back in the fall of 1945. Up until the spring of that year, he knew nothing about the developments involving nuclear weapons. Roosevelt had kept him in the dark, and everybody else has kept him in the dark, except for those people who were intimately involved in the development of these in Los Alamos. So he becomes president. In July of that year was the first nuclear test in the desert in New Mexico. Then in August 6 and 9, weapons were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, leveling both cities. The war ended about a week later. So there you are, Harry Truman. You've got a dilemma. You've got the most powerful weapon that has ever existed. And what do you do with it? The dilemma being it's so powerful that if you begin to use it in war, and other countries have it too, you're basically committing suicide. So you've got a situation where you have a weapon that should be so powerful that it ought to be able to dictate what it is we want done in foreign policy. And yet it's very forced, the very capability it has for widespread devastation. I mean, you can't use it in war very well. So what were the options that they were thinking about at that time? I'll generalize here, but basically I think you could say there are 3 or 4 of them. One was to basically keep the secret, because at that point, as we thought, it was a secret. People we thought around the world would never figure out, at least it would take them quite a while to figure out how to devise and build this kind of a weapon. So that's one option, keep it secret. And the other part of that equation is if somebody around the world begins to show signs of developing weapons, then attack them, preempt. And there were people who advocated that in the very early days, that if the Soviet Union showed any signs of acquiring nuclear weapons, we should attack. Truman didn't do that, and no other president did, but that was one of the things they were talking about. Another option was, okay, maybe we can negotiate our way out of this. Maybe we can figure out a way of involving other countries in a total ban on developing nuclear weapons. We'll give up our nuclear weapons in the United States. All other countries will say we refrain from building them. We'll have an international system of verification that will tell us whether there's any cheating going on or not. And from that basis, we'll move into a nuclear-free world. We'll never develop these things, because if other countries develop them, then all hope is lost. Sooner or later, there'll be a nuclear war. That was a position that was adopted by most of the people in the scientific community that built these nuclear weapons. And it turned out to be the position that was adopted by the Truman administration in 1946. It was called the Baruch Plan. And it did provide exactly what I said, namely a total ban on nuclear weapons development, an international organization that would control this process and would also develop the civil uses of nuclear materials, because at that time, and still today, there is a use for these nuclear materials in generating power. Something like, I guess, maybe 30% of our energy today still comes from the large nuclear reactors that were built 20 or 30 years ago. So that was another option, and the one that was more or less accepted. Another option that basically came up later, but was still discussed in those early days, was maybe we can figure out a way in which we sort of control nuclear weapons so that they are conducted, held in a safe way, deployed in a safe way, things that would prevent a war from happening. That idea later became known as arms control, and basically with the aim of trying to stabilize the nuclear deterrent. So you let things go, but you would put in place certain agreements and make it a little bit safer to have them. And the final option that was before them was, okay, well, let's just not do much of anything. Let's treat these things as kind of another weapon and hope for the best. That option, frankly, in large parts of the past 70 years, is essentially what we did, with add-ons that have to do with minor adjustments. So those are the 4 options that he was confronting. He got nowhere, of course, with the Baruch Plan. In those days, Stalin was still alive. Stalin insisted that he wanted to have the nuclear bomb if the Americans had it. So there was no hope that there would be anything like what was being proposed. There was also, from 1950 to the end of the Truman administration, the Korean War, one of the biggest wars we've had since World War II. And all of that meant there was really no real chance of doing much of anything to control nuclear weapons. I often wonder whether, if there had not been a big war with Korea, in Korea going on, whether we would have had better luck in controlling it trying to bring under some international system nuclear weapons. I suspect he would have had a bit better luck, but that was history. Along came Eisenhower, a man, of course, much better prepared for the presidency in this particular regard than Truman was. Eisenhower had commanded armies in Europe. He had actually thought about strategy. He came to the office thinking that perhaps this weapon was so powerful that it would abolish war. And he frequently spoke about that. Some of his most eloquent moments was when he was talking about how nuclear weapons will destroy civilization and how they could do something about that. I brought along a few quotes, but I won't take the time to do that. But his theory was, well, perhaps we can rely on deterrence, on what John Foster Dulles, his Secretary of State, called massive retaliation. And in order to inform his administration about what he really wanted to do, Eisenhower did something that I've not known any other president to do. Namely, he summoned together in the White House a group of experts, and he asked them to think about three big options that would govern strategy of his administration. This was in the very first year, in 1953. And one of them was containment, which had been advocated by George Kennan. Another was rollback, which is being advocated quite widely in the United States. That is to say, push the Soviet Union out of Eastern Europe, rollback. And it was thought that with our superiority in nuclear weapons, our ability to deal effectively with our allies in Western Europe, maybe we could roll back the Soviet Union and change the agreement in Yalta that had been reached between Roosevelt and Stalin and Churchill. Well, the third option was kind of a hybrid, but the idea of a red line. We draw a red line at some point, and the Soviet Union steps across it in any respect, war. Well, the option that was selected was containment, meaning that we will try to work to prevent the Soviet Union from expanding. And this is focused mainly on Europe, because that's where the confrontation really was taking place. That was the most important prize, as everyone saw it, in terms of the Cold War. So what would back up the idea of containment? Well, nuclear weapons. And how would we do that? Through deterrence. And we would say that if the Soviet Union tries to move into Western Europe, that's war. That is general war, as it was called. So there was, as Eisenhower liked to put it, manifest determination to use nuclear weapons if the Soviet Union tried to invade our NATO allies. The NATO alliance having been formed in 1949. Well, I think we should pause a moment and think about deterrence as it was used in those days, because it was not designed to be an all-purpose kind of medicine for whatever came along. It was intended basically to prevent one single thing from happening, namely the Soviet Union from invading Western Europe. What Eisenhower did tacitly over the next 8 years was essentially to create a kind of zones of interest, series of interest, we call it, classical balance of power terms. So that whatever the Soviet Union chose to do in Eastern Europe was something that we might wring our hands about, but we wouldn't do much about it militarily. We would have the same position in Western Europe. So nuclear deterrence was not designed to prevent the put down of a German insurrection in East Germany. It was not designed to prevent the invasion of Hungary when Hungarians rose up against Soviet domination in '56. It was not designed to deal with problems in Poland. It was not designed to deal with the Warsaw Pact invasion of Czechoslovakia later on in 1968. So think about deterrence as having a very limited particular purpose, because I want to come back to that later on. Well, Eisenhower, I think, succeeded in creating a system which was deter, contain, and negotiate. And he was the one who really got started in a serious way with negotiations with the Soviet Union. This was, of course, after Stalin died in '53. And after the Korean War ended in the same year. Eisenhower was determined he was going to move through some kind of a relationship with the Soviet Union where war was not so imminent as it had been. So instead of the Baruch plan, which was kind of an all or nothing plan, which is our official position for nearly 10 years, he decided to opt for what they called in those days partial measures or first steps. And one of the very first steps they came up with was a ban on the testing of nuclear weapons. He was the one that in 1958 essentially started serious nuclear test ban negotiations, which finally matured during the Kennedy administration and went into effect, as I said, 50 years ago, this month, on a limited basis. So that kind of an approach, I think, basically dominated for many years thereafter. After Eisenhower left office, there was a period of about 20 years, from about 1960 to about 1980, when there was a period when what was called arms control took over. And the whole purpose of arms control, again, was not aimed at getting rid of nuclear weapons or necessarily reducing them, but to create a situation where their use would be less likely. They wanted to create a stable deterrence, and stable deterrence was really the name of the game. How do you do that? And so all of the arms control efforts that were made during that time were essentially aimed at that. And some very important treaties came out of that. In addition to the Limited Test Ban Treaty in 1963, there was the very famous now Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which went into effect in 1970. And that basically was a deal between the nuclear halves, which were essentially the same permanent 5 members of the Security Council that we have today, the officially recognized nations that have nuclear weapons are Britain, France, China, the United States, and Russia. Those are the 5 officially recognized nuclear weapon states. They're the only ones that are under the Non-Proliferation Treaty are recognized as such. Everybody else who at that stage had no nuclear weapons were basically committing themselves not to acquire them. And there was a deal made. The basic deal was those countries that have nuclear weapons will work to get rid of them. Those countries that do not have nuclear weapons will refrain from doing so, but there will be research and development permitted for civil uses of nuclear weapons. Think of that when you think about Iran today, because that's what the deal was, and that's what the Iranians say that they are abiding by, which technically is true. So that was a major development. In addition to that, there was another big development. In 1975, a treaty called the ABM Treaty, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, came into effect under Nixon's administration, negotiated by Nixon and Henry Kissinger. And it basically provided that there would be a very limited number of anti-ballistic missiles permitted, but not enough really to affect a deterrent situation. So we gave up under those, in terms of that treaty, the right to develop full-scale ballistic missile defense, partly because we didn't know how to do it at that time. The other part of that deal was, in fact, what they called an interim agreement. It wasn't officially a treaty, but it was called SALT, Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, which resulted in an agreement that limited, did not reduce, but capped nuclear weapons programs at a certain level. So again, the idea was not to get rid of them, but to stabilize things, and that was aimed at stabilization. Non-Proliferation Treaty was aimed at stabilization, and in the beginning, the Test Ban Treaty was aimed at that as well, because it would have prevented countries from acquiring nuclear weapons if they couldn't test. As it was, it wound up with a treaty that allowed people to test underground, and so it had a very important environmental effect, and I think an important political effect in terms of being the first nuclear agreement that was reached between ourselves and the Soviet Union. So out of that particular period came some very important agreements. But think of that, during that 20 years, nobody spoke about getting rid of nuclear weapons. Stability was what we were talking about. And yet think about the broader picture that existed at that time. We had the Cuban Missile Crisis 50 years ago last year, which almost brought us to the brink of nuclear war. I was startled to learn. I had actually been at the UN headquarters when that transpired. And I asked Adlai Stevenson at the time, after Kennedy's famous speech of that year, 52, 62, sorry, were the nuclear weapons in Cuba? He didn't know, and nobody knew, no American knew, because the weapons, the nuclear warheads themselves, as opposed to the missiles, had been secretly shipped and had been already unloaded without our knowing that. And the very next day, another batch was unloaded. We learned later, to my great amazement, I learned this many years later, that there were big nuclear weapons, megaton weapons there. I had assumed that these were just sort of tactical, low-yield weapons and not many of them. It turned out there were a lot of them. There were enough that had we gone to war, there would have been devastation of the United States and of Russia, because we would have retaliated, of course. So we came very close. There was a point in time during the Cuban Missile Crisis when Moscow gave their military on Cuba free hand to use nuclear weapons if they saw fit. That was rescinded at the time, but for a while, there was a real danger that we were going to end up in a really big nuclear war. That was 63, sort of the beginning of this 20-year period. Then, of course, we had Vietnam, which took us into another bloody war which lasted a lot of that period of time. We had later on the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. We had various crises in the Middle Eastern War, 1973. We had crises in Eastern Europe. We had the invasion of Czechoslovakia, as already mentioned. So it was not a stable time. If you look at what was going on in terms of warfare practically all over the world. So how do you square that? Nuclear deterrence aimed at one particular objective, then and now still essentially preventing the use of nuclear weapons by other countries, and largely in those days, and still to some extent, focused mainly on Europe. Now, the big change that occurred, here I'd like to dramatize a little bit. Enter Ronald Reagan, stage right. Ronald Reagan came into office with a totally different view about nuclear weapons than that which had endured for most of the history of the nuclear era up to that point. He considered them morally wrong. He decided long before he took office that he wanted to move away from the idea of holding the populations of other countries hostage. He said it is not right that we should be preventing war by the threat of wiping out whole populations. We have to find some other way of doing this. I might, in fact, if I can find it quickly here, mention to you a few things that he did say. In his 1984 State of the Union, he said, and I quote, "A nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. The only value in our two nations," he's talking about the Soviet Union, he's speaking to the Soviet Union from the podium of the Congress at that time, "the only value in our two nations possessing nuclear weapons is to make sure they will never be used. But then, would it not be better to do away with them entirely?" Question mark. And he acted on that. A couple of years later, he made another speech, and he spoke of deterrence. And he said, "For too long, we and our allies have permitted nuclear weapons to be a crutch, a way of not having to face up to real defense needs. We must free ourselves from that crutch. Our goal should be to deter, and if necessary, to repel any aggression without a resort to nuclear arms." So that was Ronald Reagan. And I was very pleased to be able to work with him with the help of the man I work for now, namely Secretary of State George Shultz, who of course became his Secretary of State and was his Secretary of State for the last 6 years of his administration. And during that time, I think you can say that Ronald Reagan turned the whole thing around. He negotiated an agreement that resulted in the elimination of a whole class of nuclear weapons, as is the famous intermediate-range nuclear forces. We had some deployed in Europe. The Russians had a type called the SS-20, which are highly efficient weapons, very good at killing large amounts of cities. And he negotiated a complete end to that. He was very lucky because sooner or later in his administration, somebody had to come along that would think as he did, and then somebody did come along, almost miraculously, a man named Gorbachev. Up to that point, he was faced with other people who were much more conservative. I think there were three of them. And as Reagan said, they keep dying on me. And there were three of them, in fact, Gorbachev, Brezhnev, and a man named Chan something. Anyway, three of them died. They were all fairly conservative. But along came Gorbachev, and he changed everything. So you basically had two revolutionaries, one in Washington, one in Moscow, on many fronts. They were revolutionaries economically, and revolutionaries also in the way we think about nuclear weapons. So he changed quite a bit. He also succeeded in essentially laying the basis for what became the START Treaty. He didn't want to talk about SALT anymore, limitations. He wanted to talk about reductions. So we coined the word START, Strategic Arms Reductions Treaty or talks. And he succeeded in pretty much in negotiating that. It was not finished during his term in office. It was picked up by his successor, George Bush I, and put into effect, and later modified because not long after the treaty went into effect, the Soviet Union collapsed. And it was succeeded by other states that actually had nuclear weapons. One of them being Kazakhstan, my friend and I back there have been, another being Ukraine, another being Belarus, and one being, of course, the Soviet Russia itself, Ford, I mentioned before. So. Anyway, so that was Ronald Reagan. And he started a revolution which has become slightly attenuated over the years, but it's still a sort of opposition. I think I'm getting a signal I should speak louder.
No, I'm turning the sound down.
Oh, okay, very good.
Sorry.
All right. Well, look, I think that's sort of the history up to now. Let me tell you this. Obama made a speech in Prague the first year that he came in office. He said essentially, I want to pick up where Ronald Reagan left off. We want to work for a world without nuclear weapons. We want to go for further reductions in the amount of nuclear weapons permitted. And so he did negotiate a treaty, which is called New START, New Strategic Arms Reduction Talks, and that resulted in a treaty which was ratified by the U.S. Senate in 2011. And that brought nuclear warheads down from what had been about 2,000 to about 50 and 50. Not a big reduction, but significant. He now speaks about trying to go beyond that with some further reductions, and we'll talk about that a bit later, but suffice it to say, there's a big question mark about whether we can go forward. Well, let's pause now and think about the issue that all of this, you can't hear me?
Right.
Okay. What's going on? Let me move this thing up here. Is this better? Yes. Hey, wow, we're coming. Okay. Let's see if that works. Does that work?
Yes.
All right. The point of this is that at certain times we should sit back and ask ourselves, now where are we going? What do we want to do? And I think this is one of those times, and I think we need to very calmly and rationally think about a world without nuclear weapons. We're going to think about, is it desirable? A lot of people think it's not. Some people argue it is. Is it feasible? I think probably the majority would say, gee, that's a pretty hard thing to do, not too likely to happen. Obama himself raised that question. He said, is it reasonable to pose an objective that many people think really can't be achieved? So it's a good question to think about. And finally, sort of the essence of all of this has been a sub-theme of everything I've been saying is deterrence. What happens to deterrence if you're talking about a world without nuclear weapons? So let's ruminate about those three questions a little while. I really would very much like to hear later on your comments, questions, and views on these things, because these are the questions that are going to be with us for quite a long time, and there are no clear-cut or easy answers to them. My take on that is that as far as desirability is concerned, You have to consider that we're only 70 years, less than 70 years now into the nuclear age, and that the probabilities are such that we'll be very, very lucky if we could get through another 70 years, let's say, without a nuclear war or without some kind of a nuclear explosion. Now, I don't think I need to dwell on the effects of nuclear explosions for this group. You've all been brought up with that. I think there are some new things that are being discovered scientifically that make the problem look perhaps even worse. Because in the beginning, we tended to focus on radiation and we tended to focus on the blast effects of nuclear weapons. I think more recently we're finding that there's a big effect from fires as well. They did talk years ago about nuclear winter, meaning that if you put enough soot up in the air from the fires in the burning cities, it lowers the temperature. Plus another thing that seems to emerge from this is that you also have an effect on the ozone layer, meaning that more ultraviolet radiation would get down to the Earth's surface because of nuclear explosions. Even in some limited numbers, for example, if there was a fairly small nuclear war in South Asia, this could have an effect. I won't describe it one way or the other, but an effect on the ozone layer, perhaps also on the average temperatures, certainly in that part of the world, maybe others as well. So a lot of things remaining to be unknown, but still, it looks pretty bad to have even a small nuclear war in terms of what it does, not only to those people who are liquidated and who vanish basically, but also to the rest of the world. So just in terms of that, I would say probably worthwhile doing it. But think about the human fallibility part of it. In one of the books out there that I hope you will pick up, not one edited by me, but one edited by George Schultz and some others, there's a picture, I think it's, oh, here it is, right here, I got it absolutely. It's on page 69, and you can't see it from here, but let me just describe to you what it is. It's a picture of a 4-megaton thermonuclear bomb that was dropped on North Carolina, right? It happened because it was on alert in a B-52, which basically broke apart. Let me just read to you. This is interesting, what it said. The B-52 was involved in the Strategic Air Command Airborne Alert Program, which involved flying B-52s carrying nuclear weapons. During the breakup of the B-52, 2 B-39 4-megaton bombs, that's 4 million tons of TNT, were released from the aircraft. One got its picture in the paper, and the picture is here. This bomb did exactly what it was designed to do. A sequence of steps was activated as it fell to Earth and prepared it to explode exactly as it was designed to. Fortunately, the one arming control switch located in the cockpit also did exactly what it was designed to do. It remained in the safe position because it had not been moved to the arm position by the pilot. But he goes on to say that 3 of those switches actually did fail, and it was only because the 4th switch in the arming sequence remained in the safe position that that bomb didn't explode. It's only hanging by a parachute from the tree. So there's the kind of human fallibility that occurs no matter how careful you are about these things, and we are awfully careful about them. But again, not too long ago, 2007, are you hearing me now? Is this any better? I guess so. 2007, there was a mistake made through a faulty paperwork and or management, if you will. And there were, I think it was 6 nuclear warheads attached to cruise missiles that were flown from Minot Air Force Base in North Dakota to Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana. And nobody knew where they were. They had not been authorized to be flown on that plane. They thought they were flying cruise missiles that didn't have any atomic bombs on them. And they didn't realize that that was a mistake until these planes got down. This plane got down to Barksdale and they were unloaded. They discovered at the time that mistakenly there were these 6 nuclear warheads that were in Barksdale instead of being at Minot Air Force Base. So what happened? Well, a lot of things were fixed, but in those cases, draconian measures are called for. The Secretary of the Air Force was fired, Chief of the Air Force was fired, and so forth and so on. But, that's one of those things that you do everything correctly as you think, and still things happen. Another problem that we have, not so much ours as a Soviet-Russian problem, has to do with early warning. Because it takes a lot of careful development of technology to make sure we know if there are missiles being launched from the other side of the world. And we have a very good early warning system, including space-based systems. The Russians, because of problems with money and so forth, do not have such a good early warning system. And there have been cases, and you probably read about them recently, where they misunderstood signals that they received on their early warning system, thinking it might be a launch of a missile against them by the United States. And fortunately, in at least two of the cases that I'm familiar with, the Russians realized that they probably had mistaken information and did not go up the line and order a retaliation. But, we're that close on many occasions from having that kind of a problem. So just because of that, I would say that one ought to try to get rid of nuclear weapons if you can. Well, is it feasible? I think it's feasible. Let me just point out to you that we actually had a rather big reduction in nuclear warheads since 1986. Since Reagan and Gorbachev negotiated together in Reykjavik that year. In 1986, there were something like 65,000 nuclear weapons in the world, most of them held by the United States and Russia, Soviet Union as it was then. Today, there are 17,000. So we've gone down from 65,000 then to 17,000 now. Some of it by treaties, but a lot of it simply because countries found that these weapons were not all that usable for them, and they wanted to spend their money in some other way. So reductions have taken place, whether we think it's a good idea or not, it's happened. Verification is something people often ask about, because it's often said, well, we're talking about things that are sort of the size of a baseball or a softball or grapefruit, as it's variously described. How do you find that? We don't necessarily spend your time looking for that kind of object. You spend your time looking at what people are doing. You spend the time like NSA does, eavesdropping on iPads and iPhones and what have you. In other words, what you do is really look for activities that suggest some kind of a link to a nuclear program. And so when you put one point out there, when you build a nuclear weapon, it doesn't stay built. You can't walk away and ignore it. You have to do things to it every so often. In other words, it takes a certain amount of tender love and care. So you see people going back and forth to these various places to do these things, and you begin to understand that's probably an illicit site for the holding of nuclear weapons. So the verification is not quite as difficult as people think it might be. In any case, I think the desirability, you can make a strong case for it. I think the feasibility, you can also make a strong case for it. Deterrence is the question that one can argue, because it's largely a psychological issue that we're talking about. Extended deterrence, namely how do we reassure Japan and South Korea and other countries that we're there for them, is always an issue. Ronald Reagan, I think, had it right, that we are able to deny other countries the ability to secure their objectives. It's called deterrence by denial. In other words, if we have the capacity to deny Russia or China or North Korea from successfully invading South Korea or from taking over parts of Japan, okay, that's deterrence. It doesn't have to be nuclear. The deterrence exists through many means, including financial. So deterrence doesn't go away in that sense. And deterrence does not go away in another sense as well. We know how to build nuclear weapons. We've been doing it for a long time. If we got rid of our last nuclear weapon tomorrow, we would not lose that knowledge. We would be able to reconstitute our forces within a fairly short period. Remember, it didn't take us that long, starting from scratch in World War II to build nuclear weapons. Now we know how to do it. We've got very sophisticated data stored away. We could reconstitute nuclear weapons if we wanted to very quickly. And that itself is a deterrent to other countries, particularly those who don't have nuclear weapons now, from moving in a way that would try to threaten our interests. So deterrence exists in many forms. It doesn't go away, but there's always an argument about have we been safer because of nuclear weapons or not. One can argue that in both ways. Well, okay, now what do we do? Here we have some agreements in place. What do we do next? I think we have to look at regional problems. I very quickly want to tell you that we are now, as you know, negotiating with Iran. We should be doing something about South Asia. We should be doing something about Northeast Asia. Because, frankly, of all the places in the world that I think is most dangerous, it really is South Asia. Because you have Pakistan, which is steadily increasing the number of nuclear weapons it has in its arsenal. You have India, which is not expanding very much, but will have to as it sees it. That in turn will affect China, which has been very, very restrained in the number of nuclear weapons it's built. It probably has only a couple of dozen that will be capable of attacking the United States. And they think that's enough because they think if the U.S. attacks them, they'll be able to wipe out a few of our cities anyway. You have in South Asia what I think of as a tinderbox, and it could be ignited fairly easily. When I say that, consider that Pakistanis have, through their cutout organizations, attacked India a couple of times fairly severely, the last time being in Mumbai. There was another occasion in New Delhi. And the Indian Prime Minister is under quite a bit of pressure to not let this happen again. And if it does happen again through one of these terrorist organizations that are supported by the Pakistani government, less so now than formerly, but they're still around, the Indians are going to be very much tempted to respond by attacking Pakistan and seizing some of its territory to teach them a lesson. Now, the Pakistanis have a strategy that they call cold start, meaning that they think they've got a force they can immediately move into Pakistan without any mobilization or movement of forces. They're all ready to go. Most people think they don't really have that capability, but the Pakistanis can't assume that. So they assume if that happens, they may use a nuclear weapon against these Indian forces. Now, picture that. You're in the middle of a war with India, Pakistan. Pakistan uses a nuclear weapon. What does India do? Nothing? Well, maybe. But that's why I say that I am worried about India and Pakistan. And that's another reason for putting some emphasis on the downward pressure on the numbers of nuclear weapons, because Pakistan is, at the rate it's going, is going to have more nuclear weapons than many countries in the world, including France and Britain and so forth. They already actually have about the same number as Britain does now. Anyway, Northeast Asia, another problem in that they have already tested, I think 3 times now. They may have as many as maybe 8 or 10 nuclear weapons, nobody's quite sure. They're governed by a leader who may or may not be erratic. In any case, he's still wet behind his ears. He's only about 30 years old. And nobody quite knows whether he's in charge of the military or just what's going on. So it's kind of a mystery and inside of an enigma, as Winston Churchill used to say. We don't know really much of what's going on. So you have 3 regions of the world where nuclear confrontations are possible. We really have to focus our attention on getting those political differences resolved. Whether we can do that ourselves or not, I don't know. We need also to work with the other members of the P5, the permanent members of the Security Council that I mentioned earlier. And we are beginning to do that. And I think if we can engage China in these same kind of talks we've been having with Russia over these years, this would be ultimately good. We really need to multilateralize our negotiations on strategic nuclear weapons, because we've been focusing almost exclusively on Russia up to now. And I think we need to do what Obama said at one point, you need to pivot to Asia. And that's where a lot of the action is, and we need to engage with China, with North Korea, with South Asia, and so forth. We need to do things on a global basis as well. The Nuclear Test Ban Treaty is one that one of the hopes could come into effect but it's very unlikely that it will in the current circumstances politically. What I've been pushing for the past couple of years is to try to do something to strengthen the various moratoriums. You see, we haven't tested a nuclear device underground since 1992 because we have had a moratorium. And the other nuclear weapon states are in the same situation. They all have declared voluntary unilateral moratoriums. That's what they call them, voluntary and unilateral. And what I'm urging is that all these moratoriums ought to be sort of a level playing field. There'll be some understanding about what is allowed and what isn't. If we do that, it's not a substitute for a treaty, but at least it moves you into a more stable situation. I also think the other big thing we need to be trying to do is preventing the addition of nuclear weapons by countries like those we've just been talking about. And you can do that through a very old idea, namely an agreement to prevent the production of fissile material for use in weapons. That's been around since 1957. But you can work at it in various ways. We've been blocked in doing it in the major arms control forum we have in Geneva, but there are other ways of going at it. And my instinct is to push for those two things, particularly focus on Asia. And I think that the world would be a safer place if we did. Let me wind up later than I hoped, but in time for some discussion about the fact that, as my colleague George Shultz would say, a world without nuclear weapons is not just today's world minus nuclear weapons. No, what it means is that there has to be political change. There has to be political change in these regions we're talking about. There has to be political change in relations between us and Russia, between us and China. And all that's going to take time and quite a bit of work. What I've been advocating, what George Shultz has been advocating too, is that we try to create something that he calls a joint enterprise. And then let's try to find a coalition of countries that will be willing to work together to create the conditions for a world without nuclear weapons. That's a phrase that appeals to me. Because if you say, I'm going to eliminate nuclear weapons, and somebody says, well, you don't know how to do it, he's right, or she is right. So what you need to do is say, okay, let's go about creating the conditions for a world without nuclear weapons. And that we can work at. If we begin to reduce between ourselves and Russia, if we engage China, we're beginning to get some of these nuclear issues under control. If we work at it also from a political standpoint, trying to settle some of these disputes around the world, then I think too that will begin to create the conditions. And I think that's a very worthy objective. I think the creating conditions for a world without nuclear weapons, hardly anybody could dispute. I think it does create a kind of a rallying cry that people can say, hey, that's not a bad idea. Anyway, I'm going to stop there because I really would like to have your views instead of mine about all these things. Besides, you probably can't hear me anyway.
Thank you, Dr. Goodby. What we're going to do is Haley's going to take is going to take the mic around. So if you have questions for our speaker, will you raise your hand and we'll bring the mic to you?
Here you go. Because you're fast. Yeah.
Yes. How many countries do we know have atomic weapons?
How many countries do you want?
Atomic weapon.
Have nuclear weapons.
I have atomic weapons? Well, it's about 10. There are the permanent 5 members who are the official nuclear weapon states, namely Britain, France, China, Russia, United States, India and Pakistan, of course. Israel has never said it has nuclear weapons, but nearly all estimates are they probably do, and have a fair number of them, ranging between 80 and 100, maybe more. The North Koreans have some, at least they have the capability to have some, because we know they produce enough material to have some, and they've conducted nuclear weapons tests. So you have to count them, I think, as well. They're not, of course, officially a nuclear weapon state, but they have nuclear weapons. And those are probably the only countries that we know. There were countries that had them that actually gave them up, which is kind of an interesting story in itself. South Africa had, when they were run by the white minority, had 5 or 6 nuclear weapons. Nobody knew they had them. And finally, they began to go towards a elimination of apartheid and towards a more democratic government, they decided to give them up. And so they destroyed them. And all this happened without people even knowing they had them. So I'll show you this is not so easy to do, but nonetheless, people weren't focusing on them very much. Of course, those countries where we negotiated these non-Lugar programs had them, at least they possessed them physically, and that included, in addition to Russia, of course, Belarus, which gave them up, Kazakhstan, which gave them up, Ukraine gave them up. So those three countries potentially were nuclear weapon states, they gave them up. And there were some countries that very seriously thought about acquiring nuclear weapons. That included Canada, which decided not to proceed that way. I'm sorry, Canada up to a point, you have to see, so that's what I was thinking of. So we can say it's about that number I mentioned, about 9 or 10.
I remember a little bit about the efforts President Obama made early in his administration to try to revive these talks and efforts to reduce nuclear weapons. And I also recall very strong criticism coming at him from the Congress for being weak or not standing up for our defense. So I wonder if, my question is, do you or your agency at the Hoover Institution, do you actively work at all with the Congress in any kind of lobbying effort to, or educational effort to try to help people understand what's at stake here?
Well, I'm here, right? Let me describe to you what sometimes we call the Gang of Four is. It consists of Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, two ex-Republican Secretaries of State. The third member is Bill Perry, also at Stanford, who was former Secretary of Defense under Bill Clinton. And the fourth member is Senator Sam Nunn, Democrat of Georgia, retired several years ago. These four men decided on the 20th anniversary of the Reykjavik summit, where Reagan and Gorbachev talked seriously for 2 days about eliminating nuclear weapons and created, I think, a large envelope for people talking about such things, even ever afterwards. And these four men decided they wanted to try to revive the whole idea, and they began to write op-eds, editorials which appeared in the Wall Street Journal. And it caught on. There was quite a bit of attention to it, including in Congress. And what George Shultz, basically his attitude is, my position is, I want people to know what I think. I want them to know what I think is feasible and reasonable. But I'm not going to go out and try to sell it to Congress. And he doesn't. Now and then, if somebody asks him to, he will go to Washington and he will appear and he'll give a talk. He's giving a talk to the American Physical Society next week, for example, in Washington. He'll probably talk about the desirability of doing something like what I've been talking about. But lobby Congress, no, he doesn't like to do that. Occasionally he'll go to a luncheon or dinner with people from the Congress, but he doesn't see it that way. What he hopes people will do with people like you and people in non-governmental organizations around the country will pick up these ideas and talk to their congressmen or debate them among themselves, decide what they think is right, move out accordingly. Bill Perry is a little more active in that because he was a fairly recent Secretary of Defense, and he's much, I guess you could say, more in demand to say what his views are, so he does that a bit. But basically, no, they don't do as much lobbying or speaking together as I would think they might, but that's the way they feel. And by the way, George Shultz will be 93 in December, so he's doing very well, I think.
I made her do it.
Can you comment on the impact or the role of non-governmental organizations, particularly terrorist organizations, in terms of the whole reduction in nuclear, or the risk associated with nuclear weapons?
Well, I think the question really is, are there organizations out there that are interested in acquiring nuclear weapons that might pose a risk to various countries, including ours? And the answer is we know for a fact that Al-Qaeda had an interest in acquiring nuclear weapons. We suspect that other organizations, not quite as widespread as Al-Qaeda, have an interest too. So it's a tremendous threat, I think, that we have to face. Now, acquiring a nuclear weapon is, in the case of a place like an organization like Al-Qaeda, they're not going to go and build a centrifuge or acid diffusion plant or what have you. They will go try and buy one, or they'll try to steal one. And of course, the experience we saw with A.Q. Khan suggests, that's not so impossible. And one of the reasons for spending a lot of time with the non-Lugar negotiations that I did was to try to button up all those places in Russia that could conceivably be a place where Al-Qaeda could either steal or buy materials. And when I say materials, that means they may not even need to have to build a bomb, which is not so difficult with enriched uranium. You just get enough of it, slam it together, it goes off. Plutonium is a little more difficult. But if you can acquire some highly radioactive material, you can make what they call a dirty bomb, meaning you just put some conventional explosive, high explosives around it, and get enough highly radioactive material, deposit it on Main Street in Stillwater, and the conventional goes off. There's no chain reaction that goes off. But all of this very, very radioactive material is spread around over several blocks. It becomes very difficult for you to use those blocks for quite a while. You have to go about cleaning it up, and in time it'll be cleaned up. But think of all the economic devastation, not to mention people, that would be damaged by that. It's probably mainly an economic tool. If it went off, for example, in downtown Manhattan or Wall Street, someplace like that, it would probably disrupt business for, many months, maybe many years for that matter, depending on how it worked. So getting a dirty bomb is not so difficult at all. And the desire is certainly there. And is it feasible? And I say, yes, it is feasible. Because if you spend any time at all thinking about how a country would deliver a bomb here, they're not going to, or an organization in the case you're talking about, they're not going about building a missile. They might just get an airplane, a light airplane of some kind. Or they might just pretend it's a bale of heroin and smuggle it through that way, through very porous borders. In any case, there's a lot of ways of doing this, getting into the country without being observed. We have a very leaky frontier, as I said. So given the will, given the materials, I think once they penetrate those barriers, getting it into this country will not be the most difficult part of it. So what you have to do is stop it at the beginning, and that's why we do all these things about, trying to bottle up the stuff and make it more controllable. By the way, I should have mentioned, and didn't, and this is a good time to mention that. One of the things that Obama did, which has been fairly successful, is that he organized something that they call the Nuclear Security Summits. And he said what we need to do is all get together at a very senior level and try to agree that we need to prevent fissile material from being misused. The first meeting was held in Washington, D.C. I think it was in 2010. And there were about 40 heads of government that showed up, rather surprisingly. And they reached a lot of agreements. A lot of things they agreed to do unilaterally. So this is going to be our contribution to helping to control these materials. So they have worked out a work plan, and the meeting is considered by most people to be a tremendous success. The next meeting was a year later in Seoul, maybe 2 years later, in Seoul, Korea. Less successful because they'd always sort of broken the ice, but they did achieve some further advances. And there'll be another meeting next spring, in April, I think it is, in the Netherlands. And that will hopefully advance us still further. So working together at the summit level to try to deal with these kinds of issues of the governments that need to tighten up controls, I think is being rather well done. Obama, in a speech he made in Berlin a few months ago, talked about having another meeting in 2016 in Washington. So that'll be probably the culmination of that whole operation. Those are very important things. They go unnoticed because they're not very glamorous, but they really do succeed in preventing this sort of thing from happening. I'm just getting started in case you think I'm going to run out. Keep going.
Do you have any comment on the depleted uranium that our armed forces use in the ammunition?
The question has to do with the use of depleted uranium. That is, after uranium is enriched to whatever percentage they want, 89%, let's say, 238, anyway. There is a depleted uranium, which is not radioactive, but that is a very heavy metal. And the theory is, I guess the fact is, it penetrates other metals like steel more easily than a steel shell would. So for some time they've been using depleted uranium in artillery. And it has been argued. I frankly have not looked into all the facts. My impression is depleted uranium is not a big health problem, but there's those who think it is. So how much have the military been using it? I don't know. I don't think they use it all that often. And I doubt that they've been using it recently in Afghanistan, not to my knowledge anyway. So it's there. It's debatable. And I'll have to look it up tonight on the web and see what it tells me. But it's probably a problem of some kind. I have not heard of it being quoted or cited as a big health problem. Because uranium is scary about how to use it. Depleted is not so bad, I guess.
I'll take it.
Well, we want to thank you for coming all the way to Big Stillwater, Oklahoma. Dr. Goodby, if you'll take a seat at the front table, I know there are people that want their books autographed, so we'll send them your way.
All right.
Thank you.
Fine. And by the way, if you have any questions, I'll put my cards here. I don't have cards on the table.